what was Alister MacKenzie up to in the 1930s? For one thing, he was building Augusta National. But more generally, McKenzie was exploring new forms of golf architecture during this period. In many ways, he was at his most experimental and even radical in the time between the stock market crash of 1929 and his death in 1934. That's what I'm talking about today with Josh Pettit. Josh is a golf architect, an associate with the firm Clayton DeVries and Pont, and the founder of the Alister MacKenzie Institute. And in this episode, Josh and I will focus on what we can learn from Alister MacKenzie's wild 1930s, how this era of MacKenzie's career influenced the design of Augusta National, and how it might light the way forward for golf architecture in the 21st century. I'm Garrett Morrison, and this is Designing Golf. Okay, Josh, I want to just set the scene a little bit here. It's late 1929. Where is Alister MacKenzie in his golf architecture career at this point?
In late 1929, he was had just opened Pasatiempo in September 8th, 1929. The Valley Club of Montecito would shortly open after that in December 30th, 1929. So, keep in mind, historically, the crash of 1929 was September, and that influenced a lot of things going forward. But as far as MacKenzie's career, he had just finished Pasatiempo. Valley Club was just getting ready to open.
Yeah, so I find this to be a really poignant moment in history. Pasatiempo opens in September 1929. This is kind of MacKenzie at the height of his powers. That first group out at Pasatiempo is Marion Hollins, Bobby Jones, Cyril Tolley, Glenna Collette. There are these beautiful photos from that day from Julian Graham, some of the best golf photos of the 1920s taken of that day. It looked like it was great weather. This is kind of the height of the Roaring 20s. And then almost immediately after that, the stock market crashes, the world changes, and we're into a new period of MacKenzie's career. So just to give people a general notion of kind of why we're talking about this subject, you've told me before in the emails that we exchanged about this conversation prior to this, you told me that you find this kind of 3.5 year period between the stock market crash and MacKenzie's death in January 1934 to be the most interesting period of his career. Why is that in general?
Well, I think there are several reasons. First of all, he was just, I think, starting to get really comfortable working outside the box. He was in this very experimental phase. And, as far as the economization is concerned, or the effects of the Depression, leading up to that, he had been thinking more and more in terms of economization of construction, economization of design, economization of maintenance. And it was at this point where he started feeling comfortable doing less conventional type of work, like we would say is maybe a lot fewer bunkers, a lot more short grass, a lot more extreme landforms, big, wild, undulating greens, with wild internal contours and also like wild tongues sticking out on sides and fronts and backs. So he was really pushing the bounds. And if you compare this work to the stuff he was doing just a few years earlier, which was also fantastic, that prior work that he had been doing was much more toned down by comparison. And so, I think, first of all, just to sort of set the stage, just more broadly, looking at his career, I kind of think of his career, his golf architecture career, because that was actually his third career.
Right.
First career was in medicine. Second career was in military. And there's a lot that can be talked about with both of those. But his third career was really golf course architecture. And of that career, I kind of break that down into 3 phases. The first phase was pre-World War I, pre-Great War. and where he was just doing stuff in the UK and a little bit in Ireland. Then the war interrupted that. The second phase was after the war, which consisted of actually like rebuilding a lot of courses that had been repurposed for military use, a lot of stuff all in the UK. And that was from really like 1918, because he was discharged even before the war had ended. You know, the Treaty of Versailles was until 1919, but starting in 1918, he started working again. And all the way through until the end of 1925, that's kind of his second phase. Beginning of 1926, he departs for America and starts what I call his like international phase of his career. And that's extended from, you know, January of 1926 until he died in January of 1934. But of that last phase, I think I also conceptualize it as breaking that down into like two sub phases, call it phase 3A and 3B. 3A would have been all the stuff he was doing pre-depression. So like January 1926 through what we were just talking about, which is like end of 1929. And then the second phase would be like post-depression, basically end of 1929 through the time he died in January of 1934. And then you could also extend a little beyond, because, for instance, the plan he did for the Ohio State golf course, which was 2 golf courses, they actually used his plan, but they didn't start building it until 1938 for the Scarlet, and then 1940 for the Gray. So that second part of his third phase of his career, I think, is when he really started getting comfortable, like I said, experimenting with wilder greens, much fewer bunkers. And we'll come back to that, I think, because I think that's really important. Creating interest with landforms, short grass, using natural features more, like creeks or whatever you could use on a property. And there was another component there too, where he was starting to get sites to work on that weren't as good. So he was getting more mundane, kind of flatter sites with less interesting features. And that gave him license to start experimenting with actually just entirely manufacturing stuff, as opposed to using stuff like dunes in the case of Cypress Point or other cool features. He had to really manufacture a lot of interest. And, you know, the Jockey Club is a fantastic example of this. And we can come back to that as well. But again, this combination of his approach to economization, given the Depression, and having not as interesting sites to work on, and having to really manufacture that interest, build a golf course that was going to be economical to construct and economical to maintain and operate.
You would think that economization and needing to manufacture stuff would be at odds with each other. Those seem to be kind of countervailing impulses, or would seem to work against each other.
Not necessarily. I mean, there's a number of ways you can look at this. There's, you know, in one instance, you can think of it as manufacturing or augmenting a site in the construction phase in order to set it up so that it's easier to maintain during the operations phase once it's actually playable. So this could be thought of as like, say, if you have some heavy soils, amending the soils. Well, yeah, there's an expense to that. But if you amortize that expense over the lifespan of the golf course, you're going to save a ton of money in the maintenance phase. So it's doing these things on the front end to save on the back end. Likewise, constructing landforms, moving earth around. And we'll come back to the advance in equipment, which was also coinciding with this time frame, where initially he was building stuff with horses and scrapers and plows and manual labor to create these landforms. And then he started using bulldozers and excavators right around that same time, 1928, 1929, 1930. And so it became cheaper to move earth. He could build landforms. And yeah, there's an expense to that. But if you create an interesting landform that has some strategic value to it, and it's all just short grass, well, going forward in the future, once the course is open, it's operational, you're maintaining it, it's so much less expensive to maintain short grass that could just be mowed with a mechanical mower than it is to have 5 bunkers right there that have drainage implications that have to be raked, all the things that we know, the maintenance that goes into bunkers. Bunkers are very maintenance intensive. So this idea of doing things during the construction phase, and there's also a way to value engineer a lot of that stuff in order to make a course operational and really economize the maintenance and operations of the course once it's open.
Okay, so this idea of economization, which was a big theme for McKenzie throughout his career, not just during the Depression, but the Depression kind of raised the stakes of economization, I guess you could say. What did economization mean to McKenzie when it came to golf course design? You've talked a little bit about what the implications of economization might be for maintaining a golf course going forward, but what about that initial design phase can be economized from McKenzie's perspective during this period?
Well, let me just start by saying he was really a student of economics. And I always like to say, McKenzie had the heart of a doctor, the mind of an engineer and or economist, and the soul of an artist. And, so he really approached things in the construction, and this goes back to building military trenches during the war. He really thought of engineering and how to economize things. He was always very interested in economics and a student of economics. And he was talking about the importance of economizing golf construction, golf maintenance, long before the Depression hit. So, like as early as 1914, he was giving lectures on economy and golf course construction and greenkeeping over in the UK to greenkeepers. By 1920, when he published his seminal book, Golf Architecture, the subtitle was Economy in Golf Course Construction and Greenkeeping.
Yeah, right.
This was 1920. So it wasn't just the Depression. He was not late to the game. He was thinking well in advance. Sorry, do you want to interject there?
No, not at all. I like that you pointed out the subtitle of that book, because it is kind of an odd subtitle from our perspective. Why talk about economy right there in basically the title of the book? But it was a big theme for McKenzie. He wrote on this and spoke on this many times during the 1920s, not just the 1930s. But yeah, please, continue.
Yeah. Well, and so I think the way I conceptualize it is McKenzie thought in terms of the economization consisted of 3 verticals: the economization of design, the economization of construction, and the economization of maintenance or operations, however you want to characterize it. And those 3 verticals were inextricably linked. So in other words, the way you would design something is going to affect the way you're going to build it, and the way you're going to build it is going to affect the way you're going to maintain it. And so you have to really think through the entire process from beginning to end, and not really have separation. Whereas, a lot of other architects in those days, and then especially after World War II, they thought of things, largely 2-dimensionally, draw it on a piece of paper, give it to a contractor. Contractor would have to worry about figuring out how to build it. And then once it was built, then it was handed over to a superintendent, and the superintendent would have to figure out how to maintain it. Well, because McKenzie was, first of all, he was an engineer by trade in the military. He thought of, when he was designing something, he was really thinking in terms of how is he going to actually build it. And then also he was a student of agronomics, and he wrote a lot about turfgrass agronomics, and he was very astute and studied a lot of the best turfgrass experts in those days. And so he had a really, really good understanding of the maintenance phase of a golf course once it was already built. And so from beginning to end, when he was starting with a raw site, thinking of, how he was going to route the holes around it, how he was going to place features, how he was going to play off some natural features. And then he was thinking of how he was going to build it, and then how it would be maintained in the future. So he had all 3 of those perspectives.
Okay, great. That gives us a nice little organization of this idea of economization. Were there any other ideas aside from economization and those kind of three pillars that you see McKenzie as experimenting with or exploring more deeply in the 1930s that we should know about?
Yeah, well, I think he was entering a phase where he became more comfortable, for lack of a better term, building template holes.
Hmm.
So this was where, again, going back to the idea of he didn't have as interesting sites, starting at the Jockey Club, which was basically just a flat, pretty dead flat piece of land, and he had to manufacture stuff, or the planning laid out for Club Nautico San Isidro in Argentina, which never got built. That was literally going to be 100% manufactured, built from dredgings, similar to the way that the Lido was built. And so, and those gave him opportunities. And then going forward to Bayside in New York, and then Augusta National, he had all these opportunities where he was starting to think more in terms of pulling inspiration from his favorite holes in the UK and Ireland, a lot from St. Andrews and some elsewhere. And so he was taking the design concepts from these holes. He was purposely not trying to copy them. And he writes about this. He's like, I'm not trying to copy these holes. I'm trying to take inspiration from the concept of these holes and apply them to a different site, and in some cases improve them. And so he became much more comfortable doing this template phase of design, and he was doing that more and more, where, like in the case of Nautico San Isidro, in the case of Bayside, in the case of Augusta, also at Sharp Park, he was using a lot of these same templates and building different versions of those holes. So I think that was a key differentiation, where he was doing that a little bit before, but not much less frequently.
Yeah, sort of a delayed convert to this idea, considering that it reached the height of its fashion in the 10s and 20s with McDonald and Rayner.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to use because I don't think he would classify them as templates. I'm not a McDonald or Rayner expert, but I don't think they would necessarily even call them templates. But that's the nomenclature I think that we nowadays think of.
I want to come back to this when we talk about Augusta National, because I think the way that he used template quote unquote ideas was pretty interesting there, where he was kind of choosing sort of off-brand aspects of certain holes to emulate, as opposed to the most notable aspects of those holes. The fifth hole at Augusta National will be a perfect example of this, where he just kind of imitated odd aspects of the road hole, as opposed to the ones that you would usually think of incorporating into a road hole template. But just for a quick digression here, and then we'll get back to the architecture, I wanted to note, I'm not sure how much research you've done into this yourself, or if this is just something I'll talk about, but McKenzie had some personal financial struggles during the 1930s that I think are worth noting, because this did seem to really affect his life. Like many people, he sort of just ran out of money and ran out of sources of income during this period. What were some of those difficulties that he had?
Yeah, no, you're right. He was really affected by the Depression. He was having a hard time getting clients to pay him for work he had already done, or
specifically having a hard time getting Augusta National to pay him and Clifford Roberts to pony up.
Yep. But they weren't the only ones. And I think this was common, probably. I mean, for people in pretty much every industry, it's like you were on, you were in a project, you had contractors that were, not getting paid entirely. You had architects not getting paid entirely. So yeah, he was really struggling, and there's letters of him writing from Pasatiempo, like, my electricity, my power is about to get turned off.
Yeah,
and
really
like,
sad.
Yeah. But I think he did a lot. He did everything he could. He was still really active, working a lot. He was writing a ton in those days. So this was kind of I mentioned earlier, he kind of had three careers, medicine, military, and golf architecture. You could say his fourth career was really as a writer, because he wrote so much. Going back before his golf career, he wrote about medicine a lot. All throughout his military career and even beyond, he wrote about camouflage and military. And then in the golf space, he wrote a ton about golf. And so he was in those years from like 1929, 30, 33, up until he died, he was writing a ton of articles, getting them published in different golf publications. And I don't know exactly the details of that. I've never found anything on that, but I'm sure he was getting paid like a little bit, to publish different articles. And that's also in the phase when he was, had finished compiling what would become the Spirit of St. Andrews and trying to get that published. And to your point, like he had this finished manuscript and he couldn't get it published. And that's something he'd been working on for years. But no publisher wanted to underwrite it in those days. And so he was just doing everything he could to make ends meet.
So let's talk about some of McKenzie's specific projects during this period. I've organized these into kind of 3 buckets, and you can tell me if these buckets don't work very well or if there's a better way of organizing them. But I have, first of all, his South American projects, which include the Jockey Club and the never built, just laid out El Boquerón, which has recently bubbled back up into the golf world's consciousness. I have another bucket of his public course projects in the United States. These would include Sharp Park outside of San Francisco, Hagen Oaks in Sacramento, and Bayside Links in New York, or what is now a heavily developed part of Queens, as I understand it.
Right.
And then we have Augusta National, which was sort of the major project of the period. It stood out in its complexity from the others, and it stood out in terms of the amount of money that he was promised or that he expected to earn from the commission. And so that was kind of its own bucket, his Augusta project with Bobby Jones and Clifford Roberts. So why don't we start with, well, first of all, tell me if those buckets work for you, if there are any additional buckets.
No, I think that's pretty well organized.
Okay, cool. So
you
South
could
America.
throw into the public stuff. You could throw in the Ohio State project.
Sure, yeah. There's the university projects. I guess the University of Michigan course was completed during this period, but perhaps designed earlier. And so there are these kind of
29.
20, designed it. So that was kind of in this period. So maybe that's its own bucket. The university courses of the Midwest that Perry Maxwell was involved with as his associate, and then Perry Maxwell himself went on to design the course for Iowa State. Those are kind of a collection unto themselves. But why don't we talk about South America? He went to South America in early 1930. This is kind of like leftover momentum from the Roaring '20s. I suppose the Depression hadn't fully hit at this point. Eventually, it ended up affecting many of these projects, but he goes to South America. He does a bunch of design work. It's sort of similar in some ways to his trip to Australia in 1926, 1927, where he kind of acts as a Johnny Appleseed, has a major project or two, but also sprinkles his influence throughout some other courses. But of course, many of these courses didn't end up really getting completed or built in the way that he would have imagined. That's the big contrast between his South American trip and his Australian trip. In Australia, many of those courses did come to be in a really kind of complete way. But South America, why don't we start with the Jockey Club? Tell me about this project and what was unique about it.
Sure. Well, real quick, I think it's interesting that, you got to keep in mind the historical context of what was happening in the world in this time frame. And there was so much change happening in the world with a global depression combined with the advance in the advance in manufacturing heavy equipment and including airplanes. So I just think it's kind of interesting that the first time McKenzie, and maybe the only time he flew on an airplane, was at the beginning of his journey to Argentina.
Mm.
So he flew from LA to Chicago in what they referred to as an aeroplane, and then took a train to New York, and then a boat down to Buenos Aires.
Yeah. Boat travel was really
but-
his thing before that. He took a boat to Australia, which was quite a voyage.
all over the world, multiple times. He like circumnavigated the globe. Yeah. So yeah, when you get to, Jockey Club, that was the commission that brought him there. Similar to, as you
Royal
kind of
Melbourne.
mentioned, Royal Melbourne was the commission that brought him to Australia. But he thought, this is a long journey, and maybe there's opportunity here. And, historically, Argentina had been a very wealthy country, by 1880, 1890 timeframe. I think Argentina was still per capita the wealthiest country in the world until the United States overtook it. And so there was a history of wealth there. And because of the British influence, there was a real interest in golf. And that had been really percolating in the 1920s. And so the founders of the Jockey Club were really keen to have what they called a Britisher, someone who was like expert in the ideas of golf course architecture, come and design that course. And they got in contact with the United States Golf Association, actually, who recommended this Britisher living in California named Alister MacKenzie. That was the connection there. So he went to Buenos Aires. Initially, the site, it was going to be 27 holes. It was going to be an 18-hole course and a 9-hole course. And then he figured out there was like enough land to build two 36-hole courses, which is now the red and the blue. And that was his gateway into South America, where he landed a number of other design commissions, including the Club Nautico San Isidro, which I think we should come back to that because that's a really fascinating project. The Mar del Plata Club, which was at the time like the only really considered good golf course in Argentina. And McKenzie wrote about it, and he said he was very impressed, and it was kind of like a Seaside Links course. It was their best course. He did some consulting work for them and put together a plan of improvements, which they didn't actually use. And then there was a separate club called Mar del Plata Parque Comet, not the same Mar del Plata, different group of guys. And he designed a 27-hole course for them, which never got built also. And then there was, as you mentioned, El Boquerón, which was going to be a private estate course. And we should come back to that also. But then there was in Montevideo, Uruguay, it was the Golf of Uruguay Club that he designed an 18-hole course for. And also at the same time, he wrote about how he got hired by several, including El Boquerón, but other people to build private estate courses. And so El Boquerón was actually like a full-on 18-hole course, but he designed other smaller estate courses for people in and around Buenos Aires of like 6 holes with 18 tee boxes, crisscrossing, little short courses, pitch and putt courses. He did a bunch of that stuff, and it's not well documented. And I've had a hard time actually like tracking down what of that stuff ever got built. But he had a fair amount of design commissions for a 2-month stretch when he was in South America.
Yeah. Yeah. A good amount of work. Again, similar in a lot of ways to what he did in Argentina. Why don't we focus in then on 3 of those commissions? We've got the Jockey Club. We've got the Club Nautico San Isidro, which you've mentioned a couple of times. And I'm curious to find out more about that because I know nothing about it. And then El Boquerón. So the Jockey Club, this was not a particularly gifted piece of land. And so how then did McKenzie react to it?
Yeah, and we sort of touched on this a little earlier. This was when he started becoming much more comfortable manufacturing features. And because it was a flat site, there was a couple of things he needed to accomplish. 1, he needed to create strategic interest. 2, on a flat site, you have drainage problems. You need to figure out how to move water. And so he devised this really clever scheme where he cut this network of swales that zigzagged through the whole property. And that network of swales facilitated the drainage. And then with all of that material that was cut from those swales, he used that material to actually build up all these landforms, mostly around green complexes. And so it was like this balancing act where he didn't have to import material, he didn't have to export material. He cut these swales on site. That created the drainage network. And then with that material, he created these very eccentric mounds, and this was, I think, a foreshadowing of what would come at Augusta, because, there's sort of like some famous green complexes, like the 16th at the Red Course you've probably seen, where these just dynamic, monstrous mounds. And there's another thing too, where this is the first time he built a double green, a shared green, which I think we'll come back to that in a second. The 9th and 18th greens of the Blue Course were one double green. So that was, for him, that was a wildly different approach to designing and building a golf course than he had ever done before anywhere else.
Okay, tell me about the Club Nautico San Isidro. What are the basics of this project?
So the Club Nautico, the Nautico San Isidro Club was right on the River Platte. And the River Platte at that point is like 60 miles wide. It's massive. But they needed to deepen the river, the base of it, for like steamships to go through. And so the founders of the Club Nautico San Isidro, they actually previously had, it was a casino. And apparently gambling had just been outlawed in Argentina. So they needed to figure out another way to like bring in revenue and keep themselves relevant. And so they thought, we'll build a golf course. So they had this piece of land on the River Platte that was literally underwater. It was like McKenzie described seeing the site, and he didn't walk the site. He, in a little motorboat, drove a motorboat all around the site in this area that was like 2 to 5 feet deep in water. And he's like, there's not much to look at here. It's all underwater. But like, so, and so the plan was they were going to be given all these dredgings from the river, and the company that was doing that, or the government, I guess, who was funding it, they were going to pay for that to happen. So essentially the club was going to get, it was going to be a pretty cheap build for them to build this golf course. And this was McKenzie's version, I think it's fair to say, of what C.B. Macdonald did at the Lido.
Right. Yeah.
This was like, first of all, a gigantic feat of engineering, just to take these dredgings from the river, put them onto a site that was essentially reclaimed land, and then shape them into features and build a golf course on it. There's a massive feat of engineering, but it gave McKenzie, again, license to think completely outside the box. Like, there's no natural features here to work with, so we've got to build everything, like 100%. Every square inch of the site had to be completely manufactured. And that's where he started thinking of, well, hey, if I've got the ability to just manufacture everything, then why not look to some of my favorite holes at St. Andrews and elsewhere in the UK? And again, not copy those holes, but use them as inspiration. So, like, for instance, and he writes about this, like the 4 par 3s at Nautico San Isidro were all modeled after some of his favorite par 3s, or what he would say, like, arguably the best par 3s in the world. And the 4th hole was modeled after the 16th at Cypress Point. The 8th hole, par 3, was modeled after the Eden, the 11th at St. Andrews. The 11th hole, par 3, was modeled after the Badan, and the 15th hole, par 3, was modeled after the Gibraltar hole that he built. That was the 8th hole at Moortown.
Yeah.
And now it's the 10th hole because of the routing change. And then on other holes, the 7th was his reproduction of the Lido hole. So the Lido hole that he built at the Lido, that he, famous for the design competition that he won in 1914, which was really his introduction to golf in America. That was kind of the first time anybody in America heard of who he was. He built a version of the Lido. It's like almost identical if you look at the plan, which was the 7th hole. Or it didn't get built, but it would have been. It would have been, the 7th hole at Club Nautico San Isidro. And the 13th hole was modeled after the 1st at St. Andrews, with the burn cutting in front of it. And Um, let's see, yeah, the 14th was modeled after the road hole, St. Andrews. The 15th was modeled after the 14th at St. Andrews. And the 17th, I think, was modeled after the second hole at St. Andrews. So on so many of these holes, he was just basically like, hey, I can manufacture this out of nothing. And let's just look to some of my favorite holes and put them together into a really interesting routing. And so I maintain that this is the most interesting design golf course that has never been built.
Very cool. This is new information to me, so I'm fascinated. And it is kind of an answer to the question of, if you're not inspired by the land, if you're McKenzie and you're not inspired by the land, what are you inspired by? Well, you maybe start to be more influenced by the courses that you've seen, and you use that as a starting point as opposed to the terrain. So fascinating project there. Let's talk about...
I would kind of refer to that as, I mean, again, this is me trying to get inside of his head, but I think the way he was thinking of this was minimalism over naturalism, or minimalism beyond naturalism. Mm-hmm. You know, whereas if you have like a really gifted site, it's trying to use the natural features as best as you could. If you have no site at all, he's still building what I think he would consider a minimalist design with minimalist features, although he wouldn't probably refer to them as that, but It was all manufactured.
Yeah. Still doing as little as possible to produce interesting golf, but you have to do more to produce interesting golf. And so
then
what is it that you do?
If you do that, again, you can build a course in a way, because he learned a lot over the previous 20 years of building courses. You could build a course in a way that would lead it to being really easy to maintain. And more importantly, this concept that he would always refer to time and time again, this concept of finality. And what he meant by finality was the true acid test of a golf course is if you can build a golf course and then it never has to be renovated.
Yeah.
If you can build a golf course and 50 years later, 100 years later, like at St. Andrews, basically, it's still the same and it's still great. And it doesn't have to be constantly renovated with, you know, every 10 years by a green committee saying like, oh, let's redo our bunkers and oh, let's redo our greens. He was always trying to build something in a way, both from an infrastructure standpoint and the engineering of how the construction would happen, and then from a design standpoint in a way that would be interesting and it would endure. And if you could accomplish finality, that was really the acid test of a good golf course.
So tell me
Sorry
about...
to cut you off there.
Oh, no, it's okay. Tell me about El Boquerón. Let's move on to that one.
So El Boquerón was an estate course. Senor Ancarena had a massive piece of land. I think it was like 10,000 acres. And he allocated this little parcel that he thought he had previously built a 9-hole course. So when McKenzie got there and surveyed the land, there was like a very rudimentary, amateurish 9-hole golf course there. And McKenzie came up with a plan to basically just demo that completely, build 18 holes. And the idea is that it was going to be 9 double greens that you hit into from opposite directions. And he got this inspiration, again, going back to the old course. You know, there's this theme that keeps coming up over and over again, which is he had this great reverence for the old course. He held it in the highest of esteem. He and Bobby Jones both thought it was the gold standard. And at St. Andrews, you know, 7 of those green complexes are played into for 14 holes. They're massive 20, 25,000 square foot greens that you're hitting into from opposite directions. And so at El Boquerón, he thought, well, let's do all 18 holes that way. Build 9 massive double greens. The routing would set it up so that you hit into these from almost opposing directions, not always exactly opposing, but from different angles, and very, very few bunkers. So I think another interesting thing to think of is like the progression of the amount of bunkers he was building on a golf course. You know, pre-crash in 1929, a lot of his courses had like over 100 bunkers. And then he got to a point where there was like, maybe 80 bunkers at like Union League, which is now Green Hills. And then you fast forward a little bit, and at El Boquerón, 14 bunkers. And in the case of Nautico San Isidro, I think it was like 17 bunkers. Case of Bayside, it was 19 bunkers. Augusta, it was like 22 bunkers. So there's this huge shift from building, 100 or more bunkers on a course to like 20 or fewer bunkers. And El Boquerón, again, it was 9 double greens, 14 bunkers, and it was really tight, compact routing that would lend itself to this like kind of just intimate experience. But again, this was built for an estate course, or it was going to be built for an estate course. So it was just a private owner. Well, it never got built.
This episode of Designing Golf is brought to you by the USGA Green Section. Meet the smartest ball in golf, the GS3 from the USGA Green Section. The GS3 ball collects over 15,000 data points that instantly measure your green's firmness, speed, smoothness, and trueness. Just drop and roll. Integrated with the Deacon management system, the GS3 ball provides quicker roll tests, precise measurements, automatic data upload, and eliminates operator bias. You can now make data-driven decisions, better manage resources, communicate to course personnel, and most importantly, create a playing experience for your golfers like never before. Start your data collection journey today with the GS3 ball and Deacon. Visit gsshop.usga.org for more. Thank you to the USGA Green Section for supporting Designing Golf. Let's get back to the episode. So let's move on to McKenzie's public course projects. And maybe we could just touch on, I mean, they're all fascinating, but I'd like to just touch on one of them that I see as really being out of the box. These projects, again, were Sharp Park, which, has its own history and deserves its own deep dive, its own episode. And at some point, I'll do that on this podcast. But this is, this is a course that's haunted my dreams for a long time. It still exists, just not in the form that it was originally built. And it's a distressed municipal property at this point. It's been threatened by closure, and there's a group of people that has fought very hard, valiantly, to keep it open. And there have been some indications that they might be able to do some work there, some renovation, to try to bring back some of the aspects of this original design. But we're not sure what the outcome of that is going to be at this point. So we can just leave that there with Sharp Park. Hagen Oaks is currently being looked at by Brett Hochstein, and I hope that they're able to do something interesting there. But the one that I really want to dig into is Bayside Links, the New York course. This is a lost course now. NLE. What was Bayside Links? Why was it interesting?
Actually, interestingly enough, I have the old aerial for Bayside, and I pitched this to a developer. I did a plan for this in Florida, I think in 2017 or 18, to recreate the Bayside course, actually, in Florida. This was before the Kaisers, who I love, ever, had started talking about Lido, at least at Sand Valley. And I had always been so fascinated with this course. I thought it would be, a great public golf course. And so I had a really good site that was a city-owned property in Florida. It would have been a municipal property, and something that would have been really affordable to build, really affordable to maintain, and really fun and interesting to play. So it was, there's some interesting things here that tie into Augusta. The time frame was, he started building this in 1931, just before he started the construction for Augusta. And it was the same architect, or it was the same contractor that he was working with, Wendell Miller. And they had just started kind of experimenting with heavy equipment, bulldozers namely, and excavators. Going back, McKenzie had used a bulldozer once before that, which was at the Valley Club. But the only thing they used the bulldozer for at the Valley Club was to move boulders around and then to bury boulders to cover boulders with material because they were too big to move. So like on the east side of the property, they did that a lot. They didn't use a bulldozer to actually shape any of the golf features. It was just a function of like, oh, we could use these like really rudimentary. I mean, if you look at what these bulldozers look like, very rudimentary bulldozers to just push boulders around. Well, you fast forward 3 years at Bayside, and the advent of dozers had becoming, they'd improved and they were becoming more used on construction projects. And so they experimented at Bayside, and that's the first time he used a dozer to really shape features, greens. And, and also in the case of Bayside, that was also a flat property that he had to create some interest. So he was building landforms, and, he did things like he buried a stone wall that went through the property. And so he was cutting material from a flat site, filling it in other parts of the site to cover old stone walls and to create shape. And that was important because that really informed the way they built Augusta. And he talks about this, he writes about this, how the experimental phase they went through at Bayside was very, very informative and very useful a year later when they started building Augusta. So that was going to be a daily fee course. It was like really, really inexpensive to play. And there were very few daily fee courses in those days. I mean, that was like kind of outside the box. Like if you're a developer, you would never think to build a daily fee golf course. But he took this flat site, manufactured a lot of really interesting landforms, some really interesting greens. It had 19 bunkers. So again, this economy of bunkering. And then that led into the following year building Augusta.
Bayside was very well received. What eventually happened to it? Why does it no longer exist?
Yeah, even through the Depression, like in the early 30s, it was extremely popular and it was doing well financially. I mean, it was just packed. It got a ton of usage. What ended up happening is, I believe, like starting 54, early mid 50s, 54, 55, a developer bought the golf course, and they determined because of just the demand for housing, everything outside of New York City was expanding in those days, and there was such a demand for housing that the land itself was just way more valuable as a housing development than it was as a golf course. And
a tale as old as time.
Exactly. And I'm kind of taking an educated guess here that there weren't, zoning restrictions that prevented them from doing that. It wasn't like, oh, this has to be zoned recreational or whatever. It was just like, yeah, they bought it. Oh yeah, we could build a bunch of houses on it. And actually what had happened is, prior to that, houses had been built kind of like all around it. And there was a school, the Bayside School was around it. So if you look at the old aerial, there's like the golf course is just a rectangle and it's surrounded by development. And that just tells the story of, that rectangle, that like 180 acres or whatever it was, would end up being so much more valuable as a housing development than as a golf course, sadly.
Yeah. Yeah. When people ask what would be the most interesting course to revive in the way that the Lido was revived in Wisconsin, my answer has always been Bayside. And so it's interesting to hear you say that there may have been an effort in this direction at one point. Perhaps that will come back around. But
working on it.
Yeah.
Still working on it. Yeah. I agree with you.
Yeah. Well, that brings us to Augusta National. How do all of these themes of McKenzie's 1930s converge on Augusta National? The things that he's thinking about, the new stuff that he's trying at golf courses. How do you see those threads emerging in the design of Augusta National?
Yeah. So at Augusta, the goal was to build the world's best inland course. They set the marker high. And they made no bones about it. I mean, they said that explicitly, like, we're going to build the world's best inland golf course. meaning at that time, all the best courses were mostly in the British Isles, seaside courses in and around Dunes Land, or places like Cypress Point in California, or, National Golf Links, which he revered, places like that. And so at Augusta, they thought McKenzie thought, I'm going to use all of my knowledge that I've gained, all of my earned insight from the last 25 years of building golf courses, and apply that to building on this inland site, a site that was actually pretty severe. Not a beautiful, picturesque piece of land, but not an easy piece of land to build a golf course on.
Not really that well suited to golf. The elevation change is too big to be considered well suited to golf.
Exactly. And this really showcases McKenzie's brilliance in routing a golf course. A lot of people think of McKenzie for his wild greens or bunkers, but I think actually his true genius beyond any of that was his ability to route a golf course in the most interesting and efficient way as possible. And I don't think there's anybody on the planet that could have devised a better routing scheme for that property at Augusta than McKenzie. But again, this is when he was starting to get experimental. And then this was also, we're well into the Depression at this point. And so there's this huge, cloud, this cloud of economics, the economic climate overhanging this. And there's all sorts of stories we could go into about, the financials of the development and how it almost didn't happen. And then once it did happen, it almost went bankrupt, and the club was restructured 4 times all the way through the 50s. And it's miraculous that it even existed to begin with, and then it actually survived. And it is what it is today. But, he was trying to economize the design, economize the construction, and using, again, his experience of using heavy machinery at Bayside. He used bulldozers at Augusta, which significantly reduced the labor costs as opposed to doing things with just large crews of manual labor. And then there was this component of paying homage to his favorite holes, the template exercise, so to speak. And, and we talked about this, Garrett, last year on the podcast we did specifically about Augusta, but so many of these holes at Augusta were really based off of the design concept was taken from many of his and Bobby Jones' favorite holes in the UK. And they both equally revered St. Andrews. To them, that was both the gold standard. So they were essentially trying to build a St. Andrews-like course on an inland property, but that wasn't flat the way that St. Andrews was flat. It was very steep, as you mentioned. And so we could go through it, but many of those holes were, based off of some of the great holes at St. Andrews and then throughout the British Isles.
What are a couple of your favorite examples of template concepts at Augusta National? And I would consider them to be very much remixed template concepts. But just to give people an idea of how McKenzie and Jones were working with influence in this design, what are a couple of specific examples that people should look to?
Well, the fourth was built after the Eden, which, most people, I think, including McKenzie, would have considered the Eden at St. Andrews the premier one-shot hole in the world. And that was really, really interesting because that was a very different take on what the Eden was. The fifth was based after the road hole. We talked about that. The sixth was really his version of the Redan. But to me, what's really interesting, there's a couple answers I'll give you to this. One, which sadly no longer exists, which was the seventh hole. Mm-hmm. The seventh hole had no bunkers. The green was built, the concept was derived from the 18th at St. Andrews, the Valley of Sin. And it was, going back to this idea that McKenzie was experimenting with these wild tongues sticking out in different directions on different greens. He had this front right section that came way down, and then it wrapped around to the back left. It created this giant, almost like a horseshoe green, but like a horseshoe at an angle, really severe. And then in between those two giant sections of the green was the Valley of Sin. And again, no bunkers, and that hole does not exist. The seventh at Augusta now is completely different. They push the green back. The green's totally different. It's surrounded by bunkers, and then they narrowed the fairway over the years by planting trees. So that hole basically is just gone. But if you look at the old photos of that hole, you'll see how wild that green was.
Yeah.
And depending on where the flag location would be on a certain day, if it was back left or front right, that would dictate like what side of the fairway you would want to land your tee shot on, which would give you the best angle of approach into that green. And so just that strategy, I think is really interesting. I love the Valley of Sin just at St. Andrews as a concept, and the fact that he applied it in a super unique way there. And then the other answer I'll give you is actually the eighth. The eighth hole is a great example of where he started doing these really, really wild, giant landforms, which had really started at the Jockey Club previously. If you look at like a photo of the 16th hole on the red course at the Jockey Club, and you see these giant manufactured landforms, and then you look at the 8th hole at Augusta National, you'd say, oh, yeah, there's this connection there. And just, the 8th is a par 5 uphill, but the green he was trying to build, it was what he considered his take on a punch bowl green. Although if you looked at it, you would probably not think of it as a punch bowl, but just the way he built all these landforms to feed shots into different portions of the green, that was like a quasi punch bowl. And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm glad we have that back, because we lost that at one point.
We did.
Now it's back.
Yeah. I think everybody's seen that picture at this point of the pancake green that was installed there because I guess Clifford Roberts wanted to create a more visibility for the gallery, but
Yeah,
that version of the hole was short-lived and eventually restored by Byron Nelson. I think Byron Nelson at least contributed to the restoration of it, and they did a pretty good job. If you look at the original picture and you look at the current version, hey, kudos. Nicely done. Maybe one of the very earliest instances of Golden Age golf course restoration.
Maybe the first.
Come
to think of it, yeah.
And they did a damn good job, and that hole is just great. I think on some days, many days, it's my favorite existing hole at Augusta National. And my understanding is that the model there was the 17th at Muirfield.
Yeah, but you're right. The hole was sort of modeled after the 17th, but then the green was his version of a punch bowl. Okay.
So he's there are some similarities. Yeah, the Muirfield hole also has some of that surrounding. It is kind of like a bit of a punch bowl like that, but Augusta's version is way more pronounced. That's from what I can see.
You wouldn't really think of it as a punch bowl, but conceptually he was thinking of how the ball would feed in to different pins and sort of call it a quasi punch bowl.
Yeah, really, and then really if you miss on the wrong side of the mounds, then things get really hairy, and that might be the main distinction between the 8th at Augusta National and your usual punch bowl, where everything kind of feeds in. There's a rejecting portion of the green complex on 8, and we see that affect players in the Masters all the time. If they have to hit that shot from down low on the left side of the 8th green complex, that is a gnarly, very difficult shot. And the chip is pretty dicey from the right side of the green complex as well. And it's all short grass.
Exactly. Yeah, you just nailed it, which is, think of how interesting those recovery shots are, and you're not playing out of bunkers.
Yeah.
It's arguably harder if the turf is maintained correctly. If you have the correct agronomic regimen and it's firm and fast, that's a harder recovery shot for those guys than hitting out of bunkers is. And guess what? It's also an easier recovery shot for high handicappers.
Yeah. Yeah. The radical elements of Augusta National's design have so much in common with the general themes of McKenzie's 1930s. The use of short grass everywhere, the minimal use of bunkers, It was much more minimal when the course was initially built. There are many more bunkers at Augusta National now, but still, compared to a lot of especially modern golf courses, Augusta National still doesn't have that many bunkers. And, it's funny to think of Augusta National being an economized design, a course that was designed to be maintained very affordably, because of course the maintenance standards there have gone a different direction and the maintenance budget has gone a different direction.
There's a bit of an irony there.
But it was designed to be maintained affordably, partly because of the period in which it was built, and partly because that's just something that Alister MacKenzie believed. It's something that he believed would give the course permanence, that would allow the course to continue to exist, which was a very much a point of emphasis for him.
And real quick, I just want to mention on the bunkering, on the minimalization of bunkering, the economy of bunkering that we've talked about a couple of times. There's a few different components to this. One is there's just the economization factor of fewer bunkers to maintain. It's cheaper to maintain. But secondly, he thought of it also in terms of if you could create sufficient strategy with only one bunker as opposed to 3 or 4 or 5 bunkers, and you design a hole in a way where the strategy value functions the same way, well, that is much more powerful actually than having all these other bunkers. So in the case of Augusta, he started with 36 holes on the plan, and then he started shot block and bunkers and got down to 22 because he thought well, there's just redundancy there. I don't necessarily need 3 bunkers if I can accomplish the same strategic value with 1 bunker. That's actually more powerful. And there's a minimalization component there where I kind of think of this in terms of writing and writers. I think really good writers, of which
I was thinking the same thing. Can write a sentence and then take away as many words as possible in revision.
Exactly. If you can express something in a sentence in 8 words as opposed to 15 words, and you're expressing the entirety of the statement, that 8-word sentence is much more powerful than the 15-word sentence.
And this gets me into the next subject that I wanted to talk about with you, or the last subject that I wanted to talk about, and that is how this era of McKenzie's career might influence the golf architecture that we do in the 21st century going forward. And I think part of that, my thought about that, is that the 1930s for Alister MacKenzie was true minimalism. He was working toward actual minimalism, which has been in short supply in 21st century golf architecture, as I think many architects who have been labeled minimalist would freely admit. I think many of the architects we consider minimalist would say outwardly, yeah, that label doesn't really fit me anymore. We've kind of lost the meaning of that word, but McKenzie was working towards something that's truly like minimalism, by which I mean he, in the design process, was trying to reduce the number of components that would lead to a great hole. He would design a hole, and then he would start to erase and condense until he got to a form that was as concise and simple as possible, but still express the idea and still produce the playing strategy that he was looking for. That is minimalism, to my mind. It's not necessarily moving as little dirt as possible, though that has something to do with it. The true spirit of minimalism in other art forms is trying to whittle down the form of something to its essence. And that's, I think, what McKenzie was trying to go for in this portion of his career. So that's my thought about how it could influence us now. It seems like you agree with that thought.
Completely agree. And I tell this to clients all the time. I'm also an amateur student of economics, and I love the study of economics. And I don't think enough golf course architects really have the thinking in terms of the true economics of building a golf course and maintaining a golf course and how that would affect the way you would design it. And going back to the 3 verticals that we mentioned at the outset, I think that's the future of golf architecture. In my mind, going forward in the 21st century, is this idea of minimalism beyond naturalism. It's not just an aesthetic quality. It's as you said, it's trying to get down to the simplest, most powerful form, and then tying that into really the financials of a golf operation, because they have to be viable. And this gets to resources, this gets to inputs, there's all sorts of rabbit holes we can go down to. But I really think that that's the future going forward is, there's plenty of clubs that have the resources to be able to have a crew to maintain 150 bunkers or however many they've got. But, there's plenty of opportunities for a really good public course, a municipal course, to have 10, 15 bunkers, a really small footprint when it comes to that, and just designed in a way where it's so easy and simplistic to maintain. A single height of cut, basically one mower, where you don't have to have different mowers with different personnel on different pieces of equipment. You can just mow it all with the same piece of equipment. In those days, they were using what we call gang mowers, which had like a giant pass, like a 9 gang unit. You do like a 25-foot wide swath of turf, and if you're mowing a course or something like that, well, you have to think about how the way you're building it to be able to ensure that it can be mowed that way. So I think that's the future of, in particular, public golf, in particular, municipal golf, is going back to the way McKenzie was thinking in early 1930s up until the time he died.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast, Josh. Always interesting to talk to you.
Yeah, always fun talking to you, Garrett. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. This episode of Designing Golf was produced by PJ Clark. Thank you, PJ. If you enjoyed this deep dive into McKenzie's career in the 1930s, I can guarantee that you would love the content that we're doing in Club TFE. Club TFE is Fried Egg Golf's membership. It's $120 a year, and you get a ton with that. So go to thefriedegg.com/membership to see what Club TFE is all about. People are calling it the hottest club in town. I don't know that, you know what? I actually agree with that. It's the hottest club in town, Club TFE. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back again soon with another episode.